Welcome to the first video in a two-part series where we build a multiplayer Wordle web application. In this video, we will focus on the front-end development of the application. We will delve into the HTML and JavaScript code, as well as discuss the design decisions I made. By the end of the video, you should have a fully built website with JavaScript code to communicate with the backend. Without further ado, let's jump into the code. Let's first walk through the HTML. At first, I wanted to have different HTML pages for different parts of the web app. I wanted a login.html page for the login page, a lobby.html for the lobby, a room.html, and so on. The main issue with this is that to navigate between pages, we would need redirects. This, however, does not work well with a WebSockets connection, because with every redirect or a page reload, the WebSockets connection is reset. So, in order to keep the user logged in, we would need to use session variables to store their information and restore them whenever they reconnect to the server. The problem, however, is that we cannot distinguish between a user leaving the web app and redirecting to a different page in the web app. Also, cleaning up when the user disconnects from the server is also tricky. This just makes it needlessly complicated, and we can always find a better solution. This is when I had the idea to create a single web page with all the pages enclosed in their own div tags. This way, we can set one of the pages to be visible by activating that particular div tag and hiding the remaining div tags. This avoids the page redirects and maintains a single WebSockets connection. When the user makes an action in one page to transition to another, the current div will get hidden and the next div will be made visible. This is in fact very similar to how the JavaScript framework React works. It uses a single web page, and based on user actions, it reacts to them and updates the DOM. The main difference between React and this implementation here is that React is simply more efficient and utilizes more complex data structures to implement additional features. However, for a simple web application, this concept and its implementation is plenty. If we step through this HTML here, you can see that this part here is the login page, this is the lobby, and so on. Each of them is enclosed within a div tag, which can be set to be visible or not, depending on which page the user is currently on. The login page requests the user to enter their username. The lobby page has options for them to either join an existing room or create a new room by themselves. The room page is a common place for all players to join before starting the game. The game page takes in user guesses, shows their current time, their character usage on a keyboard, and their recent guesses. And finally, the end page allows the players to start a new game and shows them their leaderboard in the current round. You can also see that I'm including the socket.io JavaScript library here, as well as our script.js, which is where we'll be implementing WebSockets connections between the front end and the back end. Now, let's move on to the CSS. The CSS is mainly to add some color and make the website look fancy. We just don't want it to be bland. So let's not spend a lot of time here, as most of it is completely subjective. Feel free to edit this file if you want to improve on the design and go through it to understand the different properties that are being used that you can modify. Finally, let's get to talking about the JavaScript, which is what adds most of the functionality for the front end. Up top, I have defined a bunch of functions that can turn on and turn off the divs controlling the different pages. This way, depending on the current page that the user is on, we can display the HTML relevant to only that. I've also defined a standard message function, which is how the backend will communicate any errors to the front end, and the front end can display the errors to the user. Here, we set up an initial page load where we turn off all the HTML pages except for the login page, which is where the user would start. We also define a bunch of page functions here so that the front end can communicate with the backend on what the user's current actions were. So there is a function to log the user in, to create a new room, to join a room, start a game, and guess a word. Each of these functions uses WebSockets to communicate to the backend. So there's a function called socket.emit in each of these functions. This takes in an endpoint to communicate to, as well as a JSON object containing information that is to be sent to the backend. In the next video, when we're discussing the backend, we look at how we can access the fields in this JSON object and use them to update the game state for each user. We also have a bunch of helper methods here to display helpful information to the player. We have print guesses to print the player's guesses in the current round. We also have print keyboard to print the keyboard usage of the player. And we have print leaderboard to show how the player has performed compared to the others in the room. I've also added a bunch of event listeners for the buttons that are present in the HTML. This way, anytime either of these buttons are clicked, we can call the corresponding event handler function up top, which would make a call to the API endpoint in the backend using WebSockets. There's also a stopwatch function to display the user's time in the current round. And we have a bunch of functions that receive communication from the backend and set up the HTML page. We have a function for a valid login, for an invalid message that could come from any part of the application, a valid room if you're joining one, a valid game load, as well as valid guesses and the end page. Feel free to step through this code to understand what each function is doing. I've tried to write it in as clear a way as possible so that you can read it and understand what each function is trying to accomplish. And that is it for the front-end design. For the backend, we need to set up classes and functions to handle requests from the front end, maintain user data, and execute game logic. We'll look into that and setting up WebSockets on the backend in the next video. I'll see you all then.